So good morning, everyone. I'm here with Milind Mehere, who's the co-founder and CEO of Yieldstreet, which many of you know is really disrupting the way investors connect and work with alternative investments. And prior to this, Milind actually co-founded a small company called Yodel, that he ended up selling very successfully for over $300 million. And so he's seen quite a few iterations and permutations of executive changes. And I'm also thrilled to have Bob Farrell, executive chairman, and for the past 6 months, I think, also CEO of GlobalTranz, a leading provider of tech-enabled logistics solutions, but more importantly, he has sat on many boards, been a successful operator, and he as well has essentially seen almost every permutation of executive team changes and evolution, both as an operator and a board member. So we're here to talk about up-leveling your leadership team. And in this context, up-leveling is really a nice euphemism for change, right? So why are we here? Because as CEOs and even as board members, and by the way, that's probably true for anyone who leads a tight, high-performing team, one of the decisions that we struggle with the most and often execute most poorly, yours truly included, is the decision to make a change on your executive team for the greater good of the business. So let me start with the bad news, right? You will not leave here today with a silver bullet or a checklist of best practices, but what I hope you do take away from the conversation is obviously 1 or 2 actionable ideas or tidbits, but even more importantly, a slightly greater awareness of the need to be very, very intentional and deliberate when making senior people decisions. And we'll get a little deeper into what that means. So let's jump in. Let's move to slide 3. Why do we believe that ELT, executive change, is inevitable in a high growth company? Why is it that we can't take that great founding team that we were all so close to and our co-founder, who was so amazing in setting up our first servers in her garage, and why is it that we can't take this team and just grow it and blow it out together as the company grows? Who wants to take that one? You want to do that, Milind?
Yeah, I would love to. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and congrats, first of all, to the Edison team with some of the updates that they provided on the portfolio company. It's really obviously an exciting time to be a founder raising money, and an exciting time to be an investor because there is so much of M&A happening. So congratulations all around. Jean-Marc, to your question, I think some of the bullets that you have outlined here are so important. I think as a founder and as an executive, it is very important for all of us to understand what our strengths are. And broadly speaking, what's good for the company. And many times what happens is that founders get too myopic because they're worried about control, they're worried about outcomes with regards to how much autonomy they will have. And they don't realize some of the undercurrents that you have outlined here on this slide. And so I think one of the really important criteria for you is to really understand the life stage of the company and who is the right team to execute on that life stage. And so I think, just in the last 15 years through the 2 companies, my previous company, Yodel, we had, about 1,400 employees. And through the 4 or 5 rounds of financing, there was a lot of changes that we had to make, both at the executive level as well as changes at various different aspects of the company. And I think some of these things really were very applicable. So outgrown Series A, Series B kind of executives, right? Because when you are at managing 100%, 200% organization as a VP of sales, it's a very different ecosystem from your first VP of sales that may be managing a 20% organization. So we were very fortunate. We actually acquired a company in Austin called Outrank, and the CEO of that company, David Rubin, became the chief revenue officer for Yodel. And it was an incredible alignment with David, as he took on that role. So that's really an excellent example. Over the years, one of the early decisions we also made, which was very important for us, is the founding team. Me and my 3 other co-founders, we were fairly young at that time, under 30, and we were building a company to sell an ad tech platform to small businesses that relied on a lot of operational expertise. And so very earlier on, within the first couple of years, we realized that we should really get a proven CEO. And that was one of the very good decisions that we made, because we onboarded and hired Code Cunningham, who actually over the next 6-8 years saw the company through the growth phase and to the ultimate exit that we got. So those are a couple of the examples that come to mind, and you can develop a very good relationship. Court is actually an angel investor in Yieldstreet, and so a mentor and advisor to me for the last 15 years. So those are a couple of examples that I can bring to bear as to why ELT change is inevitable, but also how should we view that, and keeping kind of the company interest in mind is very important.
That's awesome. And one of the things, Milind, that I would add to that is, a lot of the time, for myself included, is, we think about performance as being the number one, we're CEOs, we're driven by outcomes. We want, performance is the number one criteria in determining whether somebody belongs on a team or not. The reality is that a very significant number of executive changes sometimes have very little to do with performance, right? And that's what that's some of the examples that we have there. Bob, from your own perspective, having sat on boards, and what are examples where the CEO needs to understand that it's not just about the performance of the individual, but that there is something fundamental that needs to be done to support the growth of the business?
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me on this morning, Jean-Marc. It is an interesting situation when you've got somebody who is performing, but either isn't fitting into the culture, isn't buying into the strategy. You have in the upper right here a brilliant a-hole. How many situations have we seen where we have someone who is using their good performance as a way to make a mark in the company, as opposed to helping the company grow? And I think the hardest thing for any CEO or any leader is to recognize those things and to make the change in a rapid enough time frame. And when I look back at my own experience and think about the things that I didn't do well in terms of making ELT changes, it's always been not doing it quick enough. The minute you start thinking about, hey, is this person who's performing really well, really hurting the culture, stymieing our ability to get into new markets, making people feel uncomfortable. The minute you start thinking about those things, you've already made your decision about that person. But it's hard to execute on that change. Of course, once you execute on the change, you feel a sense of relief. You get a round of applause quietly from everybody in the company for finally moving on it. But you're right. Performance does not necessarily drive 100% of the reason why you should or should not have somebody. Just building on a little bit of what Milind was saying, I'm not a founder. I've been the CEO who's been brought in 4 different times to take over for founders who have either reached their ceiling, meaning they've taken the company as far as they can get to. They've become too emotionally wrapped up in being able to make the changes with their executive team to help the company go forward, or they've just become combative with the investors because they've become arrogant or otherwise not aligned with where the investors want their investment to go. And when you come in like that, and you are the first of the ELT change as a new CEO, it's a real difficult situation because you've got a lot of people underneath you who perhaps had a long term with the founder, a long term with the previous CEO. They may or may not be well liked within the ranks of the company, and you've got to make those sometimes what will seem like unpopular changes, but that's why we're in these positions of senior management.
So in terms of being super sensitive to perhaps sometimes non-performance issues, what sort of techniques do you use to get, as a CEO, or quite frankly, even as a board member, both of you, for kind of getting unfiltered feedback on your executive team? How do you do that? Because you don't want to, you can't go to the peers and ask them to necessarily give direct feedback to you about their own peers, right? So how do you get real unfiltered feedback?
Well, I'll go first if that's okay. I think that one of the key ways to do that, particularly when it relates to people in the field, sales leaders, services leaders, those types of individuals, is to spend some time with them out in the field. See how well the customers and your partners and your channel resellers are reacting to their style. See how deep the relationships are. I'm involved with a company right now where, recently the CEO's performance had been called into question, and it came to light that he really didn't know how poor the individuals under him were performing. So as a board, we had to sort of force the issue and spend some time in asking questions with him and asking him to get more aligned with the customers and to check base with those customers and see what that feedback was like, and use that as a feedback loop. I think the other thing is that the Edison, the EDN. One of the things that Edison does is really make sure that in addition to the investors on the board, they have operators. Those operators can have very casual conversations with the leaders of companies to understand, what's going on, much more different than the investors. I mean, with investors, there's always sort of this overhang of, what are they going to think? We don't want them to get worried about the investment or whatever. The independents can kind of get a perspective that is more useful.
That's super helpful.
Yeah, Bob, I think if I may just jump in here on that last point that you made, I think that is very valuable. Some of the other techniques I have actually used is when you're having offsites, and sometimes I have used external coaches / consultants to conduct the offsite. And as a part of the offsite prep, I encourage those facilitators to actually have a very detailed conversation with the management team, not only to kind of make sure that the offsite topic is are good and effective, but a way for them to assess what's on the mind of the ELT. So that I have found, obviously, actually from time to time, very, very useful. There are other tools that I have used. So 360 feedback is actually, very valuable, a way to do that. And, we are using actually last couple of years, a tool called Culture Amp that really lets us give peer feedback. And so I have used that to collect feedback on the team during the annual review processes, as well as kind of quarterly check-ins. I also use a very effective informal tool called Start, Stop, Continue. And I think that is a really good way to give quick feedback. So I kind of batch it together, and on a quarterly or 4 months basis, try to have that conversation with my directs. And one of the informal indicators that I have seen in terms of when you need to make that change, if I'm doing those very often, that's when it's kind of an indication to me that there is something that's amiss there, and we need to start thinking about kind of moving on, or really kind of figuring out if that person is performing according to the expectations that we have.
That's awesome. I mean, this.
I think Chris.
No, go ahead, Robert. Go ahead, Bob.
Chris just made a great comment in the chat box about CEOs being open, not only being open to feedback, but allowing the team to give it comfortably. And I think many of you, on this forum this morning have probably experienced situations where people who are underneath feel that senior management, whether it be the CEO or anybody on the ELT, just isn't approachable. So I think for companies that promote a culture of at least a flat ability for people to communicate upward what they feel, what they're seeing. I have to say, I've always gotten great feedback from the customer support organization. These are the people who, when they pick up the phone, it's often not somebody on the other end saying, "Hey, I just wanted to tell you everything is great." They're calling because they've got a problem. And when you listen to that problem, you wonder why you're not hearing about this. Why isn't this bubbling up to you? And it's probably because you've created or you have some cultural walls up that prevent the feedback from getting up to the ELT. So I think through things like town hall meetings, sub town hall meetings, little group meetings, where you can get groups of people together from across the company, independent of their position and where they sit in the hierarchy, to feel comfortable about talking. It is a little bit of a double-edged sword. I do feel that in a couple of situations, I made people so comfortable that my inbox filled up a little too much. So you got to balance that out. But you want to get that feedback.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to go back to the Milind's earlier point, which is I found using offsite, particularly facilitated by professionals, to be hugely valuable. And so it's a tool, certainly the 360 feedback, talking to the field, you're going to gather a lot of individual feedback, which is super important, but you're not going to get a lot of feedback on how well your team, your leadership team works together. And so that's also one of the critical aspects that may lead to making a change, right? And so using that coach, and Milind, there are lots of, I love the start, stop, continue. I know it resonates with a lot of people in the audience, something that we've used. Sometimes the simplest tools are the ones that help make those difficult conversations less awkward and just more structured. And so another thing, for example, that we've used as well, that was introduced to us by one of our coaches, was we also do a very, very simple self-assessment of team alignment every quarter. Every executive fills in a anonymous questionnaire that takes literally 10 minutes to complete. And then we kind of look at, on 5 dimensions, the alignment of the team: trust, alignment, conflict. And basically, what this does is that the numbers themselves and the assessment don't really matter, but it allows you as a CEO, as you see the trend on your team, if conflict is not being handled well, or if there is some misalignment around goals, it's actually your first signal and your first indication that you need to look at the composition of your ELT. So again, I think, Milind, this is probably one of the most important points, which is there are lots of little simple tools that you can use to kind of gather some data points. Again, you will never have the silver bullet, but you will get some data points. So if we can get to the next slide and be respectful of time. I'm sorry, Milind, you were going to say something else.
I was going to make a quick point, which is when you think about 360s, right? I think one of the things that I have found super helpful is that in the tool that we use, Culture Amp, I get to choose. So the directs propose who they're going to get feedback from, but I get to choose who I can add and subtract, right? So I do a lot of skip level feedback into that. So not only just their managers, but 2 or 3 levels down if the org is big enough. And one of the things I have found is that today's millennials and today's workforce is a lot more open, a lot more transparent, right? And so from there, you get so many nuggets on management style and like some little things that, can become a really good conversation to have that conversation with your, ELT, because they may not even be aware of it. And I think so that's anyway, a very small, kind of tip.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I see in the chat, the reason my eyes are darting is not because I'm not paying attention, it's because I'm trying to multitask and look at the chat. I think one of the points that Steve Schloss is making, which is super, super important, this is something that we actually did at ComplySci as well, which is to be super explicit and almost pedestrian about your company values and norms, right? Norms meaning how do we behave as a company, as a team? Because people understand, culture, values, it's a little bit nebulous, but those norms of how we behave are really kind of what defines the culture of the company. So for example, at ComplySci, we didn't have values, we had 3 norms, right? Which were, how can I help? I'm hungry for more, and I'm a humble rock star. And so those were, once you define those kind of very basic, explicit norms, it becomes much easier to be objective about even somebody that you care for very deeply as a person, as a partner, as a colleague. You can have those very specific norms that help you be a little less, perhaps personally biased in your own decisions. So one of the topics that we talked about that Bob, you made, one of the points you made earlier is that you never regretted making a move too fast, if I'm paraphrasing here, but you've always regretted not making it faster. So as a CEO, I love to hear about this. And here is why. One of the first questions is, when my board members come to me and say, hey, CEO, how's your senior VP of sales doing? How's that going? What do you think? Is this are they helping me? Are they telling me it's time to make a change? What are they really saying as a board member?
They're saying you should have already made the change is what they're saying, I think. Because for it to get to a board level, kind of observation, that means there's been some things happening that, haven't correlated with what the expectations are for that particular person. And I think, as we go along and build our companies and they go through the different stages that Milind was talking about in his first comments, the people we need are different. And boards have this, outside perspective and can look at that more objectively sometimes than the CEO who is in the battle every day. And I've seen some, you're going to have Flint Lane on later. Flint has done a great job of always anticipating where the puck is going versus where the puck is, and making sure that he's hiring for that where the puck is going position. And sometimes that means that you have to question the person that you have in the role, and move on that person. When it gets to a board level discussion, then I think you're actually calling into question the CEO's capability. Why haven't they, him or her, recognized that, I've been emotionally wrapped up in this business. I've been working hard to generate results. Meanwhile, I've got a CRO or VP of development or whatever the case is, who is where the company was a year ago versus where the company is going to be in 3 years.
Yeah. And I think, Bob, you're absolutely right. I think from a founder perspective, the timing becomes a really kind of critical issue. And what is here on this slide is so true. I think there are a couple of challenges here. One is loyalty, right? Because you have people who have helped to build and have been in the trenches, like let's say when you're talking about Series A and Series B. And so the important thing for the CEO to be is be very objective, right? And not fall in love with your early set of leaders. And I have found myself waiting too long many times. And as much as I say hey, I need to move forward, sometimes there are just practical constraints like budget, right? So I know where the puck is going, but am I going to be able to attract talent, or should I wait for 6 more months? And of course there are, effects of that we all have to, deal with. But I think, that, it's an interesting kind of dichotomy to understand, okay, how I know I want to move fast. Can I move fast now with the constraints that I have? And then in many cases, I actually want to retain that person, but how do you layer them effectively is also a big question. And I have done it successfully, and in some cases not done it successfully. And so that's always a challenge. And that's why this whole concept of when always puts me in a spin, so as to speak.
Yeah, if I could just add one other point to what Milind was saying there. I have a situation that back in my first CEO role where I had a VP of sales who did a great job in taking us from a $5 million company to a $25 million company. And during that time, he went from 3 or 4 salespeople to 20 some odd salespeople. And, we didn't want to be a $25 million company. We wanted to be a $100 million company. So we went through the process of planning out our next year and planning that growth. And his position was, hey, listen, I got 20 salespeople all making their plan. They're all making their OTE. They're maximizing the variable. Why do I want to have to go hire managers and hire another 50 salespeople? Half of them aren't going to make their numbers. Well, it took us halfway through that fiscal year to realize that his attitude and his resistance to our planning, which was in the prior year, was really holding us back. And this was a person who, allowed us to raise 3 rounds based on his performance. It was a person who got us a great value for the company. I became friends with him and his family. It was not a fun day to have to make that change. But the minute we made that change and brought somebody in who was much more aligned with our core values, aligned with the strategy of the company, and willing to do what we needed to do to take the performance to the next level, we were on a path to where we wanted to go. And that's a hard thing. And to your point, Milind, about becoming emotionally wrapped up with some of these people, it's impossible not to. It's impossible not to.
It's impossible not to, and this will sound very cliched and perhaps self-serving as well, but I would say in every single instance that I've been involved in, it actually is better for the person involved as well, who's receiving the bad news. And one example of that's very still close to me is I hired a technical leader who was a super rock star in their organization to become a first-time CTO in a very small business, saying, this is a small-scale business. He's done this many times. He'll learn. This is a great opportunity to grow into a CTO role. And the reality is that the business grew too fast for him. He couldn't grow fast enough to make that. And so it ended up being detrimental to him because I personally felt emotionally responsible for, hey, take a chance, take that first job that you wanted, and I'll help you, and I'll groom you, and I'll develop you. And at the same time, I also felt responsible because I knew it was hurting the company. And so it was probably one of the toughest decisions that I've had to make as a leader because I was so committed to that person's personal development. The reality is, once a decision was made, it was so much better for the company. I really probably regretted not having made the decision a good 6 months earlier. And it turned out to be phenomenal for the individual who ended up going to go on to a great career at Facebook and great companies. And so I know intellectually we all understand this, but emotionally it's still difficult to incorporate. But it's true. When you hear people telling you those things, it is true. It's most often it's better for the person as well. There's another great example in the chat that my colleague Amy Kadomatsu brought up as well, if you guys are watching the chat, which is, what do you do when you're just bringing somebody way senior over someone who's already on your team and is doing a decent job, right? So Bob, that head of sales, if you had decided you wanted to keep them, but just bring in a more senior leader, how do you handle that transition? And Amy makes an excellent point, which is, the number one thing I would say to these people is, trust me and give me 6 months. As a CEO, trust me, give me 6 months. And if this is not better for you, having this senior leader guide you, mentor you, let's revisit this conversation in 6 months. But for now, just assume, give me the benefit of the doubt. And so I would say 3/4 of the cases, and I think Amy would agree with that, it's actually a great conversation to have. And in half of the cases, the person ends up really benefiting and growing and developing from it.
Yeah, I think it provided you bring in the right person who understands what they're walking into and isn't threatened by the former person who was running things that they're now running. I agree. I think that there are different people who have different emotional capabilities to accept something like that. And positioning it the way you said, I think is great, and I've seen it work on many occasions where the person is actually relieved that you brought somebody in who knows more. You don't know what you don't know, and when you bring somebody in who knows those things and is willing to help you be more successful, and to now provide the buffer between what this former person who is running it now and the new person who's over them are taking responsibility for challenges and dealing with problems that they couldn't deal with before. It's great. Now I have seen a couple of situations where, and it was my own fault, where I brought somebody in who wasn't willing to do some of the roll up your sleeve type work that was still required given the point at which the company was at, and really looked at the person who they were now coming in over as the person who was going to do all the work. So I think in the recruiting process, you need to be real sensitive to, maybe someone who's had a few exits and they're looking for one more ride. I always think if you can bring someone in over who's still very hungry, maybe hasn't made that much money yet, you're going to be better off.
Totally. Hey, I know we're running behind, and it's all because of Greg, by the way, not us. Can we just move to the next slide? I just want to at least make sure we touch on some of those tips that we've already talked about, because they're really, really important. So the first one is the point that I think Steve Schloss articulated much better in the chat, which is, honestly, the most important thing you can do as a CEO to be more, to use my term, intentional and deliberate about making ELT change is establish very, very specific norms about expected performance and expected behavior from your executive team. And it sounds obvious, but it's really hard, especially for us CEOs, because presumably we assembled a team of people who we think is the right team and who we think are smart enough and bright enough and hopefully are going to do a great job for us. And it may feel a little patronizing or condescending or repetitive to be repeating those basic norms and expectations to your own leadership team, but you absolutely have to. And it doesn't have to be heavy-handed, just like Milind explained with start, continue. It doesn't have to be heavy-handed. It just has to be consistent and regular so that there are no surprises. And then I would strongly urge you, if you don't do that already, to do a quarterly assessment of your senior team, like a formal assessment, not something big or fancy, but at least 1 or 2 pages in your board deck every quarter about the way your executive team is functioning. And so that will force you as a CEO to establish also that discipline of looking at your team with a more objective lens. The coaching, the surveys that Milind and Bob mentioned, super important. What else in terms of feedback did we touch on today, Bob and Milind, that you want to make sure people take away?
Yeah, I think, Jean-Marc, one other thing in terms of kind of assessing and having those hard conversations, right? What I have found very useful is a rubric that, I kind of, maintain, which is, it's almost like a Venn diagram, right? And so you really have to, and I have used this in the past when I'm talking about either layering a person or like saying that, hey, we want to get like senior leadership, is encouraging them to really think through the rubric, which is like 4 quadrants, right? What are you good at? What are you not good at? What do you love doing? and what an organization needs. Because it's very important, right? Like it's like, yeah, you're good at, not good at, but it's also what do you love doing, and the organization needs are super important. And that intersection is something, will bring out a lot of things that, are very good exercise points to really make that person understand. So I think that's another aspect of, if you think about tomorrow's organization and the point around how do you assess that is something that that can be a super useful tool.
Totally.
And I would just emphasize that all the CEOs on this call all have boards that ideally have at least one independent non-investor member, and it's hard as a CEO to have conversations about your ELT with other members of your ELT without undermining people. Right. But the independent members of the board are there for you to talk to and to share your thoughts with without fear of undermining somebody on your own team. And you can do that more semi-formally at every quarterly board meeting. I agree with that, Jean-Marc, that doing that in a non-exec session when all the execs leave, that's I think a big part of those agendas is to go through the people. But being able to pick up the phone and call your independent director and say, hey, let me just bounce off you what's going on with my SVP or my senior chief technology officer is what do you think of this? And sometimes just talking it out with that person is really helpful because you can't do it with anybody on your team.
Yep, totally. I'm going to close the session with one last really important question that just was brought up, which is, can you talk about how to best handle an upgrade misfit? Meaning you've brought in the new person, you've layered them on top of your existing people, and they completely flame out. And you have to not only go find a new person, but you have to explain to your board, and more importantly, to your own organization, why when you said to them, give me 6 months, trust me, it ended up being a flame out, right? And I know it's a situation that we've all encountered. I've encountered it. You bring in a senior leader, they don't work out, and you have to sell them to the organization. And 6 months later, you have to explain to the organization, guess what? What we sold you 6 months ago turned out not to materialize. And so those I find, even though they may sound kind of scary transition on the heels of, and really critical and important because, hey, you messed up the last time, so you really want to make sure the next time you don't mess up. And it may make you move a little slower. Those are the things that you can't really let paralyze you, quite frankly. And I found that the best policy is to be very transparent. I've stood up in front of my organization a few years back and said, hey, I know this is disappointing. I know we as a leadership team made a mistake and did not hire the person we thought was the right individual, but we learned a ton. We're responsible. We're accountable. We learned a ton. We're going to move quickly, and we're going to make a better decision next time. But I think it's very important to own it because otherwise the organization will start thinking, that you're a very mercurial leader and that whatever your whim is at the moment, whoever the favorite person of the day is, gets your attention. So I think that transparency, I think Kelly, you summed it up. Transparency, accountability, speed. Those are really, really the key things. And pull the trigger, own the mistake, pull the trigger, do it. All right. Greg, do you want to take it on?
Look at that transition. How about it? Gentlemen, I want to thank you. You can, as usual, generous with your time, both Bob and Milind. Thank you. And the information, just looking at the chat and a couple of emails that I've actually gotten as Jean-Marc elicited those great remarks from you. We'd love to be able to follow up. I have a publishing deal for you, Milind, with your tools. I'll take a small royalty. Bob is much more expensive from what I remember. So we'll talk separately, but in all seriousness, gentlemen, and Jean-Marc, especially to you for putting this together, thank you. I'm speaking for the entire group, I'm sure. Outstanding and critical. I mean, let's face it, this is the tough conversation from the beginning to the end, and to be able to actually give that type of information to folks is exactly what the group wanted to hear. So appreciate your time today, guys, and hope you can stick around for the next session and next two sessions as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.